good to see everyone. So my talk today is about value and values of Web3. I think this being a blockchain kind of gaming conference doesn't require me to do the introductory stuff, so I thought I'll just get to the heart of things. So first, I want to focus a little bit on the conversation of value, especially at a time when today, the market is obviously doing a lot better, thanks to Bitcoin spot ETF and everything. Sometimes it's important to understand why these value systems work, and then later I'll talk about values, making sure that we understand why we're here. So values are network effects. Let me first iterate sort of where value network effects used to basically accrue. In Web 2, when you had the ability to read and write to the web, they created large amounts of data. And what's happened in these frameworks, that data became the most valuable of resources, it actually was the engine in which the network effects were able to grow. So for instance, every time you share a photo on Instagram, you're actually giving value basically to Instagram, which they then basically monopolize, and they create network effects out of those. And the same goes for every platform in Web 2 today, right now. And that's because data has compound network effects. The more data you layer on top of data, the more network effects it generates. That's actually the reason why AI can do what it does today, for instance, whether it's OpenAI or Perplexity. And that's why Google and Facebook and all these companies have this value and this incredible power, right? It's the network effects that they create. And when you look at, for instance, the biggest companies in the world today, they basically rule over us in the sense that you have absolutely no control over them removing you on their platforms, whether it's Instagram or Facebook, right? I mean, they're basically kind of like digital feudal kingdoms. And these network effects basically have created so much value from us as a data resource. We basically then give them information, which is photos and log text and information and everything else, which then basically creates huge network effects in the form of initially knowledge and then our social relations. We bring in our customers, we bring in our friends, we bring in our fans, and then basically they monetize us, right, by selling us advertising and so forth. And the biggest companies in the world today are actually all data companies. The top 10 companies in the world are basically data-rich companies, save one, and they're all worth trillions of dollars. And I remember a time, I'm a little older than most of you probably, but let's say 15 years ago, where the biggest company in the world was barely $300 billion. And today, trillion has become the new billion, just to give you sort of indication of that. But the reason this works this way in Web 2 and the value accrual is because when these networks, which are isolated from each other, right? Facebook and Apple and Google and TikTok and X and any one of those Web 2 companies out there don't really talk to each other. They're connected to each other with very thin rails. Generally speaking, they build their own network effects and they jealously guard them. And you can only access them with permission. Like, if you want to access the network effect of Facebook, you have to access and use their SDK and you have to use their API, which they can remove at any time. But every time you use the API, you're actually giving them value, which is great. You're enhancing the network, you're making them larger, and then they can remove you. The most famous example in the era of Facebook was, of course, when Zynga basically became potentially even bigger than Facebook, giving them all these network effects, and then basically they removed those network effects, they limited it, and Zynga almost went out of business back in the day. So that's kind of how Web 2 network effects work, and all this value basically gets concentrated to these companies. But Web 3 is different. In Web 3, network effects, because of its permissionless nature, are actually broadly open to everything. And so you see this effect particularly now more in fungible tokens, but eventually also in non-fungible tokens, which I'll explain a little later. Which is now that these network effects operate with each other means that, in this case, liquidity is shared across. This means that, for instance, if you have, whether it's SAN tokens or ApeCoin or Ethereum or Solana, they may seem like they're different systems, but in reality, they're shared across a permissionless chain where liquidity can cross over, which means the entire network basically has effects that accumulate and compound on top of each other. So one way to think about it is, imagine what would happen in the world if Facebook and Google and Apple actually merged their network effects because they were permissionless networks. You wouldn't see a value increment of 10 or 20 or 30%. You would see a value increment of 100, 200, 300x or even more, because these network effects compound on top of each other, except now they're also community owned. I think this is one of the big differences in Web3, which is also the reason why, even though your communities might be smaller, in Web3, value forms much more accelerated, which means if a network, even outside, like for instance, when you look at the growth of various other L1, L2 networks, there used to be this talk, for those of you who remember 5-6 years ago, about the Ethereum killer. Nobody talks about that anymore, but back then that's what they used to talk about, because they were thinking Web 2. They were thinking more in the framework of how do you become the biggest L1 and L2. But today people have come to realize that actually interoperability is much more valuable, and they all plug to each other because you can share these network effects and you can grow in an accelerated manner. Meaning that even if other new L1 and L2s become even bigger, actually the entire network gets to benefit. So this is one of the key areas why Web3 is so different in comparison to Web 2. And the way that it's represented is the token. Now the token is also interesting because many people look at tokens maybe as a currency. Cryptocurrency is kind of the classic definition, and they look purely at the financial side. Or when we think about gaming or Metaverse, for instance, we think of the token maybe purely from the utility side. But actually what tokens really represent as a model for the first time, I would say in maybe forever, is a representation of the network effect of the platforms you're building. Right, so you think of the classic equity instrument, which is, shares in a company. You can only really have some value extraction from the profit of the company, and that's what the equity represents. But a token doesn't represent that. Right? If you buy Ethereum tokens, you're not buying Ethereum tokens because you think it will produce value in the form of gas. That's not how it works. I mean, none of you here are buying Ethereum because it gives you 4 or 5% yield in, staking fees, right? That's not the reason you do that. You're buying Ethereum or any one of the tokens because you want to be part of the network and partake in its network effects. And the value of Ethereum and any other sort of token system comes from the network effects that are built around this. And I like to think of it sometimes a little bit like, like a shopping mall, right? If you're the landlord of the shopping mall, maybe as an equity instrument, you can get the rent and that sort of the rental income from that, and that gives you a value of the actual, let's say, landlord of the mall. But the actual entire network of the shopping mall, which brings in customers and the businesses in there and the community that goes, is actually not measured. But a token can measure that. And the reason why it measures that is because it has two elements of networks that are very prominent. The classic one is the utility that you all know about. They could be in games, they could be in the metaverses, they could be in other types of utility in education. But the one thing that's actually very powerful is the financial network effect, which basically happens right from day one, also represented in the token, because the token has both the velocity and the liquidity of the financial network and the utility all embedded in one system. In the traditional tech world or financing world, those were separated, meaning that in order to create the utility growth, you needed the financial input from a VC. Right? It took Facebook 6 years and $1.3 billion to become a profitable business. Today, it seems much faster in Web3, but it's faster because essentially the token represents the financial market right from the get-go when you launch it. And whereas before, it wasn't the same, which also means, by the way, that founders who are driving these kind of companies have to be aware of both of these network effects in their system. Many Web 2 companies that turn to Web 3 often ignore the financial aspect of the token to, basically the detriment of their project, because that's the superpower of Web 3, that these network effects that are financial in nature can also be connected with the network effects that are utility in nature. One of the other network effects that we have when you look at, for instance, NFTs, is that aspect of social identity and social identifiers. So the velocity of what we see in the markets comes from the fact that we can see the transactions quickly. So if someone buys an NFT, we know its value, we know its price, and we can measure that as a form of information. And the same is true, with fungible tokens. I mean, imagine in the physical world, if every time someone bought real estate somewhere in the world and that information became public right the moment it was transacted, it would create a different effect in the market of real estate, for instance. But you can't do that in the physical world, but in the digital world, you can do that. But the other network effect, which I think is a more powerful one, is the social cultural one, which is one that we haven't really properly measured because it's hard to do. Right? Why do people buy, a Rolex watch, for instance, or why do people buy this Birkin bag? Right? It's physical, maybe, and often people sort of wonder whether that should be more valuable than the Bored Ape, which is virtual, even though the Bored Ape is worth more. And that's because people don't buy a Birkin bag to put stuff in it. They don't buy a Rolex watch to tell the time. And they don't buy a Ferrari to take you from point A to point B. The real value is in the social network effects that they signal. Everything you purchase in the real world actually are these type of social network effects. And in some ways, money has become the way in which we try to measure that social network effect. So if you have more money, then there's a certain kind of social network effect that happens. But then there comes a point where money alone can't represent that. And so we look for other forms of social network sort of identifiers, which then form our identity, whether it's the places we live, the areas we travel to, the identities we have, or the objects that we own. They all form part of that. We do this every single day. And that's probably another part of the network effect, which basically in Web 2 has been farmed through the social network effect. And basically in Web 3, we can now own that in the form of digital property. In gaming, we already spend over $100 billion on these virtual goods that we don't own that give us these status. They don't give us advantage in the games. They're trinkets, they look good, or you achieved it because you were a very good gamer. And you see this also in areas of virtual games and metaverses as well, when you own land and sandbox. And of course, this industry, as a result of this, has now had sort of a resounding sort of comeback when you think about from what just happened just a year ago. And the whole total market cap, basically, of Web3 is roughly $2.6, $2.7 trillion in size. Far cry from where it was about a year and a half ago. So we can all sort of sigh, sort of a breath of relief, basically, that, the way that value can form in Web3 is obviously happening much better. But the one thing I also want to focus on is the values of Web3. So all of this helps us identify how network effects form and how value is created. But I think what's even more important to focus on is the values of Web3, as in why are we doing what we're doing? Because if we don't really focus and concentrate, especially in a time when the bull market is starting to sort of emerge a little bit more, is we have these situations, right? Because value forms so quickly because of the financial and the utility network effects, as you've seen in token. I mean, you look at some of the most recent IEOs, for instance, the value creation can happen very quickly. But then we also sometimes forget why we're here. And then what happens, this is just the sort of the most recent example, and he's now in jail. But the point is that when you have that, greed starts to come, people start to feel like, they make money maybe, which is fine, but then they start maybe moving on the wrong set of values. And then actually what happens is that when you damage the ecosystem, you don't just damage yourself and maybe people around you, you actually hurt the entire ecosystem. So it's worth reminding why we're here. In Web3, we're now able to have the web of ownership. We can have digital property rights. We're doing something in the network where we're all shared in the same ecosystem. We're not actually building something that is just for us. In Web 2, it was very zero-sum, which means that you're only building for a company that will succeed in its own way, which also means, by the way, that if that company fails, then really it only affects that company, right, in some ways. But in Web 3, network effects are shared, which also means that if there's a problem, they're shared as well, right? If there's a hack that's happening in some L1, L2, the entire ecosystem gets affected. It's not actually just that isolated chain, for instance. So it's important to remember that we're in a shared network in which we all have property. It means every end user has a stake as well, because even if you own just a token, you are now a stakeholder in that network. One of those examples of those values that are so powerful is that we can now go from corporations to basically these decentralized autonomous organizations that are actually community owned. And when you even think about how L1 and L2s operate, they're basically community owned. Nobody owns Ethereum. Nobody really owns Solana. Nobody really owns, sort of these ecosystems that are out there. And just to illustrate, DAOs, so this is an old slide, sorry, DAOs have more like $34 billion of value right now. But the important thing about the $34 billion is that it's governed by potentially 10 million people, of which 3 million people are essentially making decisions on $34 billion of value at this moment in time on a weekly basis or a monthly basis. There is no single shareholder corporation in the world that can do this. The biggest companies in the world, be it Facebook or Apple, have somewhere between 30 to 80,000 shareholders. That's their governance. But in Web3, you can have 1 million, 5 million, 10 million, 100 million, 1 billion stakeholders. That's one major element that's so different about this framework. That's what we're building for. We're building for not just a truly decentralized ecosystem, but also one in which you can basically share in that stake and have governance and a say, which we can't have today. And we also see that this benefit goes and starts with ownership. So the number one reason why people play blockchain games basically is because of ownership. Because the power of ownership isn't just the value. The power of ownership is actually that you have a stake in it and that you have a say in what you can do. This is the reason why at Animoca Brands, what we often do is we talk about sharing and investing in the shared network. We've done over 450 investments in Web3, and sometimes people have said, well, that seems kind of like, spray and pray and see how it goes. But our view is different. It's not just about sort of investing broadly in the ecosystem and taking broad bets. It's about putting back in the area ecosystem that has given us value as a result as a business. I'll give you an example of what the world would look like. Imagine if Apple, which has about $163 billion of cash, right, were to take 10% of their money and actually make an ecosystem fund to invest in apps and other things that build on the Apple App Store ecosystem. That would be $16 billion of venture capital funding that would go to startups in the App Store ecosystem. What would happen to the Apple ecosystem? It would be healthier. It would have funding. Smaller companies would actually have the ability to get support. It would create much more happiness in the ecosystem, and probably none of the developers would mind paying 30%, right? But neither Facebook or Apple or Google, none of those companies do this. The top 10 companies in the world have $1 trillion of cash, mostly sitting in Ireland, basically just collecting interest for the most part. And this is not the ethos of Web3. You'll notice in Web3, all the companies, even exchanges, are actually prolific investors because they recognize that they're building on a shared network, which means you give back as much as you, sort of whatever you receive, quoting back, isn't charity, it's investing. It's actually a way to contribute back into the ecosystem. That is an important part of Web3. And I think many of you here as well will have probably started off in Web3 and suddenly you've become investors of your own and you've bought some tokens here and you've bought some projects there. It's a very different type of ecosystem. And so what matters in Web3 is that the value is basically shared across. So it's not concentrated on investors and builders only, but users and creators, which I'll go into a little bit, actually also basically get a significant share in the value of what's being built in Web3, which is also why we think Web3, which is why Web3 wins. Now, stakeholder alignment comes through ownership. Just a couple of minutes for closing here. I think, again, when you have ownership in those networks, in those L1, L2s, and the games that you do, and the NFTs and the projects that you're aligned with, you have a much deeper connection with your community. Right? You have a direct relation. You can actually go and target your 1,000 true fans, which is, again, something that you couldn't really do in Web 2. You could have 1 million followers on Instagram. You have absolutely no idea who they are and actually how much they utilize your products. And the same goes for music. In the world of Spotify, you might have 10 million listeners. You have no idea which person listens to your music 10,000 times and buys all your merch, or the user that listened to it only once. You had no idea, for instance, right? And again, this gives you that stronger alignment because you can tell what relationships you have with them, and also they have an interest in your success. So, some closing thoughts. Capitalism and property rights are connected, meaning that Web3 is at heart a capitalist structure, right? And so this is also important, I think, to understand here that the foundation of property rights and capitalism are tied to each other. And today, there's a big sort of, for the reasons I mentioned earlier, there's a big sort of lack in trust in especially young people around capitalism because the world is becoming more unequal, right? And, with this concentration of wealth that I had just illustrated before, we have this effect where like during COVID, after COVID, $42 trillion of new wealth was created. 2/3 of that wealth went to the top 1 percentile, and the other third went to the 99%. Doesn't sound particularly fair. And so we shouldn't be surprised that most people outside of Web3 feel disenfranchised with capitalism. But this is the opportunity again, because Web3 is a capitalist system that is more inclusive and therefore has the potential to deliver not just digital property rights, more financial literacy and inclusion in Web3, as we've seen in places like the Philippines and Latin America, and basically provide access and actually turn more people into capital owners and to capital class, which have been excluded. Because even if you just own a token, you're actually become a capitalist of sorts, right? And of course, the market has been improving, but I want to just close with an example of the kind of value distribution that happens in Web3. In the gaming industry, we spend about $100 billion a year advertising, basically to bring users into traditional games. Most of the money goes to Apple, Facebook, Google, the usual guys. How much of that money do you think actually goes to the gamers who actually play the games that they receive from advertising? 0, right? And how much of that money that those platforms make actually then goes into funding game studios or game developers. Almost zero as well. So it's one of the most extractive tax that's out there. And it's ironic because actually we're spending all this money to bring in gamers to play games, and those gamers don't even get the benefit for that. But in Web3, you have this lovely thing called airdrops. And I think people outside of Web3 look at airdrops and get really, really confused because they say, well, isn't that just free money? I would just give it away. The answer is it's not. It's kind of like advertising, except you're targeting your customers. And what happens when you pay money or give money to your target audience by rewarding them to play the game? Two things. The chances of them putting back money into your game, investing in your game, or playing your game is much, much higher. And even if they don't play your game, they'll probably play another game, right? And this is kind of how these network effects are formed and shaped in Web3, completely different than you see in Web2, where you don't have those incentives that are shared. And in the last 3 years, over $21.7 billion of tokens were airdropped of value onto community members. Probably the largest, I guess, wealth distribution you can think of any type outside of government handouts, in the last 3 years and growing. And it's become a very sort of, whether it's token farming, whatever you want to call it, it's the same mechanisms out there. And, we have to mature them, and they're not perfect. But they are ways in which we basically reach our customers directly as opposed to going to these extractive owners. So that's another reason why Web3 is so much more better. And again, what we want to protect is the mechanisms in where we give value to users directly, because that gives value to the networks that we want to protect. In closing, I said this before, but property rights is the foundation of our physical rights and freedoms, and the same is true for digital. We need to have digital property rights to have our digital freedom and to have those liberties that we respect and want to have in Web3. That's what we're trying to protect. Those are the values of Web3, to build in a shared network and to basically have digital freedom and digital property rights. Thank you very much.